of the more formal seaside resorts at that time. It was, you must understand, the custom of the steam railway companies to sell their carriages after they had been obsolete for a sufficient length of years, and some genius had hit upon the possibility of turning these into little habitable cabins for the summer holiday. The thing had become a fashion with a certain bohemian-spirited class. They added cabin to cabin, and these little improvised homes, gaily painted with broad verandas and supplementary lientos added to their accommodation, made the brightest contrast conceivable to the dull rigidities of the decorous resorts. Of course, there were many discomforts in such camping that had to be faced cheerfully, and so this broad sandy beach was sacred to high spirits and the young. Art, muslin, and banjos, Chinese lanterns and frying are leading notes, I find, in the impression of those who once knew such places well. But so far as I was concerned, this odd settlement of pleasure squatters was a mystery as well as a surprise, enhanced rather than mitigated by an imaginative suggestion, or so I had received from the wooden-legged man at Championbury. I saw the thing as no gathering of light hearts and gay idleness, but grimly, after the manner of poor men poisoned by the suppression of all their cravings after joy. To the poor man, to the grimy workers, beauty and cleanness were absolutely denied. Out of a life of greasy dirt, of muddied desires, they watched their happier fellows with a bitter envy and foul tormenting suspicions. Fancy a world in which the common people held love to be a sort of beastliness, own sister to being drunk. There was in the old time always something cruel at the bottom of this business of sexual love. At least that is the impression I have brought with me across the gulf of the great change. To succeed in love seemed such triumph as no other success could give, but to fail was as if one was tainted. I felt no sense of singularity that this thread of savagery should run through these emotions of mine, and become now the whole strand of these emotions. I believed, and I think I was right in believing, that the love of all true lovers was a sort of defiance then, that they closed a system in each other's arms and mocked the world without. You loved against the world, and these two loved at me. They had their business with one another, under the threat of a watchful fierceness. A sword, a sharp sword, the keenest edge in life lay among their roses. Whatever may be true of this for others, for me and my imagination, at any rate, it was altogether true. I was never for dalliance, I was never a jesting lover. I wanted fiercely, I made love impatiently. Perhaps I had written irrelevant love letters for that very reason, because with this stark theme I could not play. The thought of Nettie's shining form, of her shrinking bold abandon to her easy conqueror, gave me now a body of rage that was nearly too strong for my heart and nerves and the tense powers of my merely physical being. I came down upon the pale sand heap slowly toward that clear village of careless sensuality. And now within my puny body I was coldly sharp set for pain and death, a darkly gleaming hate, a sword of evil drawn. Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 6. I halted and stood planning what I had to do. Should I go to bungalow after bungalow until one of the two I sought answered to my rap? But suppose some servant intervened. Should I wait where I was, perhaps until morning, watching? And meanwhile, all the nearer bungalows were very still now. If I walked softly to them from open windows, from something seen or overheard, I might get a clue to guide me. Should I advance circuitously, creeping upon them, or should I walk straight to the door? It was bright enough for her to recognize me clearly at a distance of many paces. The difficulty to my mind lay in this, that if I involved other people by questions, I might at last confront my betrayers with these others close about me, ready to snatch my weapon and seize my hands. Besides, what names might they bear here? Boom! The sound crept upon my senses, and then again it came. I turned impatiently as one turns upon impertinence, and beheld a great ironclad not 4 miles out, steaming fast across the dappled silver, and from its funnels sparks, intensely red, poured out into the night. As I turned, came the hot flash of its guns, firing seaward, and answering this, red flashes and a streaming smoke in the line between sea and sky. So I remembered it, and I remember myself staring at it in a state of stupid arrest. It was an irrelevance. What had these things to do with me? With a shuddering hiss, a rocket from a headland beyond the village leapt up and burst hot gold against the glare. The sound of the third and fourth guns reached me. The windows of the dark bungalows, one after another, leaped out, squares of ruddy brightness that flared and flickered and became steadily bright. Dark heads appeared, looking seaward. A door opened and sent out a bright lane of yellow to mingle and be lost in the comet's brightness. That brought me back to the business at hand. Boom, boom, and when I looked again at the great ironclad, a little torch-like spurt of flame wavered behind her funnels. I could hear the throb and clangor of her straining engines. I became aware of the voices of people calling to one another in the village. A white-robed, hooded figure, some man in a bathing wrap, absurdly suggestive of an Arab in his burnous, came out from one of the nearer bungalows, and stood clear and still and shadowless in the glare. He put his hands to shade his seaward eyes and shouted to people within. The people within, my people. My fingers tightened on my revolver. What was this war nonsense to me? I would go round among the hummocks with the idea of approaching the 3 bungalows inconspicuously from the flank. This fight at sea served my purpose, except for that it had no interest for me at all. Boom, boom! Huge, voluminous concussions rushed past me, beat at my heart, and passed. In a moment, Nettie would come out to sea. First one, and then 2 other wrappered figures came out of the bungalows to join the first. His arm pointed seaward, and his voice, full of tenor, rose in explanation. I could hear some of the words. "It's a German," he said. "She's caught." Someone disputed that, and there followed a little indistinct babble of argument. I went on slowly in the circuit I had marked out, watching these people as I went. They shouted together with such a calm and intensity of direction that I halted and looked seaward. I saw the tall fountain flung by a shot that had just missed the great warship. A second rose still nearer us, a third and a fourth, and then a great uprush of dust, a whirling cloud, leaped out of the headland whence the rocket had come and spread with a slow deliberation right and left. Hard, on that an enormous crash, and the man with the full voice leaped and cried, "Hit!" Let me see, of course. I had to go around beyond the bungalows and then come up towards the group from behind. A high-pitched woman's voice called, "Honeymooners, honeymooners, come out and see." Something gleamed in the shadow of the nearer bungalow, and a man's voice answered from within. What he said I did not catch, but suddenly I heard Nettie calling very distinctly, "We've been bathing." The man who had first come out shouted, "Don't you hear the guns? They're fighting not 5 miles from shore." "Eh?" answered the bungalow, and a window opened. "Out there." I did not hear the reply because of the faint rustle of my own movements. Clearly these people were all too much occupied by the battle to look in my direction, and so I walked now straight toward the darkness that held Nettie and the black desire of my heart. "Look!" cried someone and pointed skyward. I glanced up, and behold, the sky was streaked with bright green trails. They radiated from a point halfway between the western horizon and the zenith, and within the shining clouds of the meteor a streaming movement had begun, so that it seemed to be pouring both westwardly and back towards the east, with a crackling sound as though the whole heaven was stippled over the phantom pistol shots. It seemed to me then as if the meteor was coming to help me, descending with those 1,000 pistols like a curtain to fend off this unmeaning foolishness of the sea. Boom went a gun on the big ironclad, and boom, and the guns of the pursuing cruisers flashed in reply. To glance up at that streaky, stirring light scum of the sky made one's head swim. I stood for a moment dazed, and more than a little giddy. I had a curious instant of purely speculative thought. Suppose, after all, the fanatics were right, and the world was coming to an end. What a score would that be for Parload? Then it came into my head that all these things were happening to consecrate my revenge. The war below, the heavens above, were the thunderous garment of my deed. I heard Nettie's voice cry out not 50 yards away, and my passion surged again. I was to return to her amid these terrors, bearing unanticipated death. I was to possess her with a bullet amidst thunderings and fear. At the thought, I lifted up my voice to a shout that went unheard, and advanced now recklessly, revolver displayed in my hand. I was 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards. The little group of people, still heedless of me, was larger and more important now. The green-shot sky and the fighting ships remoter. Someone darted out from the bungalow with an uninterrupted question and stopped, suddenly aware of me. It was Nettie, with some coquettish dark wrap about her. and the green glare shining on her sweet face and white throat. I could see her expression, stricken with dismay and terror at my advance, as though something had seized her by the heart and held her still, a target for my shots. Boom! Came the ironclad's gunshot like a command. Bang! The bullet leaped from my hand. Do you know, I did not want to shoot her then. Indeed, I did not want to shoot her then. Bang! And I had fired again, still striding on, and each time it seemed I had missed. She moved a step or so toward me, still staring. And then someone intervened, and near beside her I saw young Virral. A heavy stranger, the man in the hooded bath gown, a fat, foreign-looking man, came out of nowhere like a shield before them. He seemed a preposterous interruption. His face was full of astonishment and terror. He rushed across my path with arms extended and open hands, as one might try to stop a runaway horse. He shouted some nonsense. He seemed to want to dissuade me, as though dissuasion had anything to do with it now. "Not you, you fool," I said hoarsely. "Not you." But he hid Nettie, nevertheless. By an enormous effort, I resisted a mechanical impulse to shoot through his fat body. Anyhow, I knew I mustn't shoot him. For a moment I was in doubt, then it became very active, turned aside abruptly and dodged his pawing arm to the left, and so found two others irresolutely in my way. I fired a third shot in the air, just over their heads, and ran at them. They hastened left and right. I was pulled up and faced about within a yard of a foxy-faced young man coming sideways, who seemed about to grapple me. At any resolute halt, he fell back a pace, ducked, and threw up a defensive arm, and then I perceived the course was clear, and ahead of me, young Virral and Nettie. He was holding her arm to help her, running away. "Of course," said I. I fired a fourth, ineffectual shot, and then, in an access of fury at my misses, started out to run them down and shoot them barrel to backbone. "These people," I said, dismissing all these interferences. "A yard," I panted, speaking aloud to myself. "A yard, till then, take care, you mustn't shoot again." Someone pursued me, perhaps several people, I do not know. We left them all behind. We ran. For a space I was altogether intent upon the swift monotony of flight and pursuit. The sands were changed to a whirl of green moonshine. The air was thunder. A luminous green haze rolled about us. What did such things matter? We ran. Did I gain or lose? That was the question. They ran through a gap in a broken fence that sprang up abruptly out of nothingness and turned to the right. I noted we were in a road, but this green mist, one seemed to plow through it. They were fading into it, and at that thought I made a spurt that won a dozen feet or more. She staggered. He gripped her arm and dragged her forward. They doubled to the left. We were off on the road again and on turf. It felt like turf. I tripped and fell at a ditch that was somehow full of smoke and was up again, but now they were phantoms, half gone into the livid swirls about me. Still I ran. On and on I groaned with the violence of my effort. I staggered again and swore. I felt the concussions of great guns tear past me through the murk. They were gone. Everything was going, but I kept on running. Once more I stumbled. There was something about my feet that impeded me, tall grass or heather, but I could not see what it was. Only this smoke that eddied about my knees. There was a noise and spinning in my brain, a vain resistance to a dark green curtain that was falling, 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 fold upon fold. Everything grew darker and darker. I made one last frantic effort and raised my revolver, fired my penultimate shot at a venture, and fell headlong to the ground. And behold, the green curtain was a black one, and the earth and I and all things ceased to be. Book 2, The Green Vapors. Chapter 1, The Change. Section 1. I seemed to awaken out of a refreshing sleep. I did not awaken with a start, but opened my eyes, and lay very comfortably, looking at a line of extraordinarily scarlet poppies that glowed against a glowing sky. It was the sky of a magnificent sunrise, and an archipelago of gold-bleached purple islands floated in a sea of golden green. The poppies, too, swan-necked buds, blazing corollas, translucent stout seed vessels, stoutly upheld, had a luminous quality, seemed wrought only from some more solid kind of light. I stared unwonderingly at these things for a time, and then there rose upon my consciousness, intermingling with these, the bristling golden green heads of growing barley. A remote faint question where I might be drifted and vanished again in my mind. Everything was very still. Everything was as still as death. I felt very light, full of the sense of physical well-being. I perceived I was lying on my side in a little trampled space in a weedy, flowery barley field that was in some inexplicable way saturated with light and beauty. I sat up and remained for a long time filled with the delight and charm of the delicate little convolvulus that twined among the barley stems, the pimpernel that laced the ground below. Then that question returned, what is this place? How had I come to be sleeping here? I could not remember. It perplexed me that somehow my body felt strange to me. It was unfamiliar, I could not tell how, and the barley and the beautiful weeds and the slowly developing glory of the dawn behind, all those things partook of the same unfamiliarity. I felt as though I was a thing in some very luminous painted window, as though this dawn broke through me. I felt I was part of some exquisite picture painted in light and joy. A faint breeze bent and rustled the barley heads and jogged my mind forward. Who was I? That was a good way of beginning. I held up my left hand and arm before me, a grubby hand, a frayed cuff, but with a quality of painted unreality, transfigured as a beggar might have been by Botticelli. I looked for a time steadfastly at a beautiful pearl sleeve link. I remembered Willie Ledford, who had owned that arm and hand as though he had been someone else. Of course, my history, its rough outline rather than the immediate past, began to shape itself in my memory, very small, very bright and inaccessible, like a thing watched through a microscope. Clayton and Swathing Leah returned to my mind, the slums in darkness, Duraresque, minute, and in their rich, dark colors pleasing. And through them I went towards my destiny. I set hands on knees recalling that queer, passionate career that ended with my futile shot into the growing darkness of the end. The thought of that shot awoke my emotions again. There was something in it now, something absurd that made me smile pityingly. Poor little angry, miserable creature. Poor little angry, miserable world. I sighed for pity, not only pity for myself, but for all the hot hearts, the tormented brains, the straining, striving things of hope and pain, who had found their peace at last beneath the pouring mist and suffocation of the comet. Because certainly that world was over and done. They were all so weak and unhappy, and I was now so strong and so serene, for I felt sure I was dead. No one living could have this perfect assurance of good, this strong and confident peace. I had made an end of the fever called living. I was dead, and it was all right. And these? I felt an inconsistency. These, then, must be the barley fields of God, the still and silent barley fields of God, full of unfading poppy flowers whose seeds bear peace. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 2. It was queer to find barley fields in heaven, but no doubt there were many surprises in store for me. How still everything was. Peace, the peace that passeth understanding. After all it had come to me, but indeed everything was very still. No birds sang. Surely I was alone in the world. No birds sang. Yes, and all the distant sounds of life had ceased. The lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs. Something that was like fear beatified came into my heart. It was all right, I knew, but to be alone. I stood up and met the hot summons of the rising sun hurrying towards me, as it were with glad tidings over the spikes of the barley. Blinded, I made a step. My foot struck something hard, and I looked down to discover my revolver, a blue-black thing like a dead snake at my feet. For a moment that puzzled me. Then I clean forgot about it. The wonder of the quiet took possession of my soul. Dawn and no birds singing. How beautiful was the world. How beautiful, but how still. I walked slowly through the barley towards a line of elder bushes, wayfaring tree and bramble that made the hedge of the field. I noted as I passed along a dead shrew mouse, as it seemed to me, among the haulms, then a still toad. I was surprised that this did not leap aside from my footfalls, and I stooped and picked it up. Its body was limp like life, but it made no struggle. The brightness of its eye was veiled, but it did not move in my hand. It seemed to me that I now stood holding that lifeless little creature for some time. Then very softly I stooped down and replaced it. I was trembling like a nameless emotion. I looked with quickened eyes closely among the barley stems, and behold, now everywhere I saw beetles, flies, and little creatures that did not move, lying as they fell when the vapors overcame them. They seemed no more than painted things. Some were novel creatures to me. I was very unfamiliar with natural things. "My God," I cried, "but is it only I?" And then at my next movement, something squealed sharply. I turned about, but I could not see it. Only I saw a little stir in a rut and heard the diminishing rustle of the unseen creature's flight. And at that I turned to my toad again, and its eye moved, and it stirred. And presently, with infirm and hesitating gestures, it stretched its limbs and began to crawl away from me. But wonder, that gentle sister of fear, had me now. I saw a little way ahead a brown and crimson butterfly perched upon a cornflower. I thought at first it was the breeze that stirred it, and then I saw its wings were quivering, and even as I watched it, it started into life and spread itself and fluttered into the air. I watched it fly, a turn this way, a turn that, until suddenly it seemed to vanish, and now life was returning to this thing and that on every side of me. With slow stretchings and bendings, with twitterings, with a little start and stir. I came slowly, stepping very carefully because of these drugged, feebly awakening things through the barley to the hedge. It was a very glorious hedge, so that it held my eyes. It flowed along and interlaced like splendid music. It was rich with lupin, honeysuckle, campions, and ragged robin. Bedstraw, hops, and wild clematis twined and hung among its branches, and all along its ditch border the starry stitchwort lifted its childish faces, and chorused in lines and masses. Never had I seen such a symphony of note-like flowers and tendrils and leaves, and suddenly in its depths I heard a chirrup and the whir of startled wings. Nothing was dead, but everything had changed to beauty, and I stood for a time with clean and happy eyes, looking at the intricate delicacy before me, and marveling how richly God has made his worlds. Tweedled tweezle, a lark had shot the stillness with his shining thread of song, one lark, and then presently another, invisibly in the air, making out of that blue quiet a woven cloth of gold. The earth recreated only by the reiteration of such phrases may I hope to give the intense freshness of that dawn. For a time I was altogether taken up with the beautiful details of being, as regardless of my old life of jealous passion and impatient sorrow as though I was Adam new made. I could tell you now with infinite particularity of the shut flowers that opened as I looked, of tendrils and grass blades, of a blue tit I picked up very tenderly. Never before had I remarked the great delicacy of feathers, that presently disclosed its bright black eye and judged me, and perched, swaying fearlessly upon my finger, and spread unhurried wings and flew away, and of a great ebullition of tadpoles in the ditch. Like all the things that live beneath the water, they had passed unaltered through the age. Amid such incidents, I lived those first great moments, losing for a time in the wonder of each little part the mighty wonder of the whole. A little path ran between hedge and barley, and along this, leisurely and content and glad, looking at this beautiful thing and that, moving a step and stopping, then moving again, I came presently to a stile, and deep below it and overgrown was a lane. And on the worn oak of the stile was a round label, and on the label these words, Swindle's G90 Pills. I sat myself astraddle on the stile, not fully grasping all the implications of these words, but they perplexed me even more than the revolver in my dirty cuff. About me now the birds lifted up their little hearts and sang, ever more birds and more. I read the label over and over again and joined it to the fact that I still wore my former clothes, and that my revolver had been lying at my feet. One conclusion stared out at me. This was no new planet, no glorious hereafter such as I had supposed. This beautiful wonderland was the world, the same old world of my rage and death. But at least it was like meeting a familiar house slut, washed and dignified, dressed in a queen's robes, worshipful and fine. It might be the old world indeed, but something new lay upon all things, a glowing certitude of health and happiness. It might be the old world, but the dust and fury of the old life was certainly done. At least I had no doubt of that. I recalled the last phrases of my former life, that darkling climax of pursuit and anger and universal darkness and the whirling green vapors of extinction. The comet had struck the earth and made an end to all things. Of that too I was assured. But afterward? And now? The imaginations of my boyhood came back as speculative possibilities. In those days I had believed firmly in the necessary advent of a last day, a great coming out of the sky, trumpetings and fear, the resurrection and the judgment. My roving fancy now suggested to me that this judgment must have come and passed, that it had passed in some manner missed me. I was left alone here, in a swept and garnished world, except of course for this label of Swindles, to begin again perhaps. No doubt Swindles has got his deserts. My mind ran for a time on Swindles, on the imbecile pushfulness of that extinct creature, dealing in rubbish, covering the countryside with lies in order to get, what had he sought? A silly, ugly great house, a temper-destroying motor car, a number of disrespectful, abject servants, thwarted intrigues for a party fund, baronetcy, as the crest of his life, perhaps. You cannot imagine the littleness of those former times, their naive, queer absurdities, and for the first time in my existence, I thought of these things without bitterness. In the former days I had seen wickedness, I had seen tragedy, but now I only saw the extraordinary foolishness of the old life. The ludicrous side of human wealth and importance turned itself upon me. A shining novelty poured down upon me like the sunrise and engulfed me in laughter. Swindles, Swindles, damned. My vision of judgment became a delightful burlesque. I saw the chuckling angel Sayer with his face veiled, and the corporal presence of Swindles upheld amidst the laughter of the spheres. Here's a thing, and a very pretty thing, and what's to be done with this very pretty thing? I saw a soul being drawn from a rotund, substantial-looking body, like a whelk from its shell. I laughed loudly and long, and behold, even as I laughed, the keen point of things accomplished stabbed my mirth, and I was sleeping, weeping aloud, convulsed with weeping, and the tears were pouring down my face. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 3. Everywhere the awakening came with the sunrise. We awakened to the gladness of the morning. We walked dazzled in a light that was joy. Everywhere that was so. It was always morning. It was morning because until the direct rays of the sun touched it, the changing nitrogen of our atmosphere did not pass into its permanent phase, and the sleepers lay as they had fallen. In its intermediate state, the air hung inert, incapable of producing either revival or stupefaction, no longer green, but not yet changed to the gas that now lives in us. To everyone, I think, came some parallel to the mental states I have already sought to describe, a wonder, an impression of joyful novelty. There was also very commonly a certain confusion of the intelligence, a difficulty in self-recognition. I clearly remember, as I sat on my stile, that presently I had the clearest doubts of my own identity, and fell into the oddest metaphysical questionings. If this be I said, then how is it I am no longer madly seeking Nettie? Nettie is now the remotest thing, and all my wrongs. Why have I suddenly passed out all of that passion? Why does not the thought of Aral quicken my pulses? I was only one of many millions who that morning had the same doubts. I suppose one knows oneself for oneself when one returns from sleep or insensibility by the familiarity of one's bodily sensations. And that morning, all our most intimate bodily sensations were changed. The intimate chemical processes of life were changed. Its nervous metaboly, for the fluctuating, uncertain, passion-darkened thought and feeling of the old time came steady, full-bodied, wholesome processes. Touch was different, sight was different, sound and all the senses were subtler. Had it not been that our thought was steadier and fuller, I believe great multitudes of men would have gone mad, but as it was, we understood. The dominant impression I would convey in this account of the change is one of enormous release, of a vast, substantial exaltation. There was an effect, as it were, of lightheadedness that was also clear-headedness, and the alteration in one's bodily sensations, instead of producing the mental obfuscation, the loss of identity, that was a common mental trouble under former conditions, gave simply a new detachment from the tumid passions and entanglements of the personal life. In this story of my bitter, restricted youth I have been telling you, I have sought constantly to convey the narrowness, the intensity, the confusion, the muddle, and dusty heat of the old world. It was quite clear to me within an hour of my awakening that all that was, in some mysterious way, over and done. That, too, was the common experience. Men stood up, they took the new air into their lungs, a deep, long breath, and the past fell from them. They could forgive, they could disregard, they could attempt. And it was no new thing. No miracle that sets aside the former order of the world. It was a change in material conditions, a change in the atmosphere, that at one bound had released them. Some of them it had released to death. Indeed, man himself had changed not at all. We knew before the change, the meanest knew, by glowing moments in ourselves and others, by histories and music and beautiful things, by heroic instances and splendid stories, how fine mankind could be, how fine almost any human being could upon occasion be. But the poison in the air, its poverty, and all the nobler elements which made such moments rare and remarkable, all that has changed. The air was changed, and the spirit of man that had drowsed and slumbered and dreamt dull and evil things, awakened and stood with wonder-clean eyes, refreshed, looking again on life. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 4. The miracle of the awakening came to me in solitude, the laughter, and then the tears. Only after some time did I come upon another man. Until I heard his voice calling, I did not seem to feel there were any other people in the world. All that seemed past, with all the stresses that were past. I had come out of the individual pit in which my shy egotism had lurked. I had overflowed to all humanity. I had seemed to be all humanity. I had laughed at swindles as I could have laughed at myself, and this shout that came to me seemed like the coming of an unexpected thought in my own mind. But when I was repeated, I answered. "I am hurt," said the voice, and I descended into the lane forthwith, and so came upon Melmount, sitting near the ditch with his back to me. Some of the incidental sensory impressions of that morning bit so deeply into my mind that I verily believe, when at last I faced the greater mysteries that lie beyond this life, when the things of this life fade from me as the mists of the morning fade before the sun, these irrelevant petty details will be the last to leave me, will be the last wisps visible of that attenuating veil. I believe, for instance, I could match the fur upon the collar of his great motoring coat now, could paint the dull red tinge of his big cheek with his fair eyelashes just catching the light and showing beyond. His hat was off. His dome-shaped head, with its smooth hair between red and extreme fairness, was bent forward in scrutiny of his twisted foot. His back seemed enormous, and there was something about the mere massive sight of him that filled me with liking. "What's wrong?" said I. "I say," he said, in his full deliberate tones, straining round to see me and showing a profile, a well-modeled nose, a sensitive, clumsy big lip known to every characterist in the world. "I'm in a fix. I fell and wrenched my ankle. Where are you?" I walked round him and stood looking at his face. I perceived he had his gaiter and sock and boot off. The motor gauntlets had been cast aside, and he was kneading the injured part in an exploratory manner with his thick thumbs. "By Jove," I said, "you're Melmount." "Melmount," he thought. "That's my name," he said, without looking up, "but it doesn't affect my ankle." We remained silent for a few moments, except for a grunt of pain from him. "Do you know," I asked, "what has happened to things?" He seemed to complete his diagnosis. "It's not broken," he said. "Do you know," I repeated, "what has happened to everything?" "No," he said, looking up at me incuriously for the first time. "There's some difference." "There's a difference," he smiled. A smile of unexpected pleasantness, and an interest was coming into his eyes. "I've been a little preoccupied with my own internal sensations. I remark an extraordinary brightness about things. Is that it?" "That's part of it. And a queer feeling, a clear-headedness." He surveyed me and meditated gravely. "I woke up," he said, feeling his way in his memory. "And I. I lost my way. I forget quite how. There was a curious green fog." He stared at his foot, remembering. "Something to do with a comet. I was by a hedge in the darkness, tried to run. Then I must have pitched into this lane. Look," he pointed with his head. "There's a wooden rail new broken there. I must have stumbled that out of the field above." He scrutinized this and concluded, "Yes." "It was dark," I said, "and a sort of green gas came out of nothing everywhere. That is the last I remember." "And then you woke up." "So did I. In a state of great bewilderment. Certainly there's something odd in the air. I was rushing along a road in a motor car, very much excited and preoccupied. I got down." He held out a triumphant finger. "Ironclads! Now I've got it. We'd strung our fleet from here to Texel. We'd got right across them in the Elbe mind. We'd lost the Lord Warden. By Jove, yes, the Lord Warden. A battleship that cost £2 million, and that fool Rigby said it didn't matter. 1,100 men went down, I remember now. We were sweeping up the North Sea like a net, with the North Atlantic fleet waiting at the Faroes for 'em, and not one of 'em had 3 days' coal. Now, was that a dream? No, I told a lot of people as much. A meeting, was it? To reassure them? They were warlike, but extremely frightened. Queer people, paunchy and bald like gnomes, most of them. Where? Of course, we had it all over, a big dinner, oysters. Colchester. I'd been there, just to show all this raid scare was nonsense, and I was coming back here. But it doesn't seem as though that was recent. I suppose it was. Yes, of course, it was. I got out of my car at the bottom of the rise with the idea of walking along the cliff path, because everyone said one of their battleships was being chased along the shore. That's clear. I heard their guns. He reflected. Queer, I should have forgotten. Did you hear any guns? I said I had heard them. Was it last night? Late last night, 1 or 2 in the morning. He leant back on his hand and looked at me, smiling frankly. Even now, he said, it's odd, but the whole of that seems like a silly dream. Do you think there was a Lord Warden? Do you really believe we all sank that machinery for fun? It was a dream, and yet it happened. By all the standards of the former time, it would have been remarkable that I talked quite easily and freely with so great a man. Yes, I said, that's it. One feels one is awakened from something more than that green gas, as though the other things also weren't quite real. He knitted his brows and felt the calf of his leg thoughtfully. I made a speech at Colchester, he said. I thought he was going to add something more about that, but there lingered a habit of reticence in the man that held him for the moment. It is a very curious thing, he broke away, that this pain should be, on the whole, more interesting than disagreeable. You are in pain? My ankle is. It's either broken or badly sprained. I think sprained. It's very painful to move, but personally, I'm not in pain. That sort of general sickness that comes with local injury, not a trace of it. He mused and remarked, I was speaking at Colchester and saying things about the war. I begin to see it better. The reporters, scribble, Max Sutton, 1885, hubbub, compliments about the oysters. What was it? About the war? A war that must needs be long and bloody, taking toll from castle and cottage, taking toll. Rhetorical gusto. Was I drunk last night? His eyebrows puckered. He had drawn up his right knee, his elbow rested thereon, and his chin on his fist. The deep-set gray eyes beneath his thatch of eyebrows stared at unknown things. My God, he murmured. My God. With a note of disgust. He made a big brooding figure in the sunlight. He had an effect of more than physical largeness. He made me feel that it became me to wait upon his thinking. I had never met a man of this sort before. I did not know such men existed. It is a curious thing that I cannot now recall any ideas whatever that I had before the change about the personalities of statesmen, but I doubt if ever in those days I thought of them at all as tangible individual human beings, conceivably of some intellectual complexity. I believe that my impression was a straightforward blend of caricature and newspaper leader. I certainly had no respect for them, and now without servility or any insincerity whatever, as if it were a first fruit of the change, I found myself in the presence of a human being towards whom I perceived myself inferior and subordinate, before whom I stood without servility or any insincerity whatever, in an attitude of respect and attention. My inflamed, my rancid egotism, or was it after all only the chances of life, had never once permitted that before the change? He emerged from his thoughts, still with a faint perplexity in his manner. That speech I made last night, he said, was damn mischievous nonsense, you know. Nothing can alter that. Nothing, no. Little fat gnomes in evening dress gobbling oysters. Gulp. It was the most natural part of the wonder of that morning that he should adopt this incredible note of frankness, and that it should abate nothing from my respect for him. Yes, he said, you are right. It's all indisputable fact, and I can't believe it was anything but a dream. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 5. The memory that stands out against the dark past of the world with extraordinary clearness and brightness. The air, I remember, was full of the calling and piping and singing of birds. I have the curious persuasion, too, that there was a distant happy clamor of pealing bells, but that I am half convinced is a mistake. Nevertheless, there was something in the fresh bite of things, in the dewy newness of sensation that set bells rejoicing in one's brain. And that big, fair, pensive man sitting on the ground had beauty even in his clumsy pose, as though indeed some great master of strength and humor had made him. And it is so hard now to convey these things. He spoke to me, a stranger, without reservations, carelessly, as men now speak to men. Before those days, not only did we think badly, but what we thought, 1,000 short-sighted considerations, dignity, objective discipline, discretion, 100 kindred aspects of shabbiness of soul, made us muffled before we told it to our fellow men. It's all returning now, he said, and told me half soliloquizingly what was in his mind. I wish I could give every word he said to me. He struck out image after image to my nascent intelligence, with swift broken fragments of speech. If I had a precise full memory of that morning, I should give it to you, verbatim, minutely. But here, save for the little sharp things that stand out, I find only blurred general impressions. Throughout, I have to make up again his half-forgotten sentences and speeches, and be content with giving you the general effect. But I can see him and hear him now as he said, the dream got worse at the end. The war, a perfectly horrible business, horrible. And it was just like a nightmare. You couldn't do anything to escape from it. Everyone was driven. His sense of indiscretion was gone. He opened the war out to me, as everyone sees it now, only that morning it was astonishing. He sat there on the ground, absurdly forgetful of his bare and swollen foot, treating me as the humblest accessory and as altogether an equal, talking out to himself the great obsessions of his mind. We could have prevented it. Any of us who chose to speak out could have prevented it. A little decent frankness. What was there to prevent us being frank with one another? Their emperor, his position was a pile of ridiculous assumptions, no doubt, but at bottom he was a sane man. He touched off the emperor in a few pithy words, the German press, the German people, and our own. He put it out as we should put it all out now, but with a certain heat as of a man half guilty and wholly resentful. Their damned little button-up professors, he cried incidentally. Were there ever such men? And ours. Some of us might have taken a firmer line. If a lot of us had taken a firmer line and squashed that nonsense early. He lapsed into inaudible whisperings, into silence. I stood regarding him, understanding him, learning marvelously from him. It is a fact that for the best part of the morning of the change, I forgot Nettie and Verrall, as completely as though they were no more than characters in some novel that I had put aside to finish at my leisure, in order that I might talk to this man. Well, he said, waking startlingly from his thoughts. Here we are awakened. The thing can't go on now, all must end. How it ever began. My dear boy, how did all those things ever begin? I feel like a new Adam. Do you think this has happened, generally? Or shall we find all these gnomes and things? Who cares? He made as if to rise and remembered his ankle. He suggested I should help him as far as his bungalow. There seemed nothing strange to either of us that he should requisition my services or that I should cheerfully obey. I helped him bandage his ankle and we set out. I, his crutch, the two of us making a sort of limping quadruped along the winding lane towards the cliffs and the sea. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 6. His bungalow beyond the golf links was, perhaps, 1.25 miles from the lane. We went down to the beach margin and along the pallid wave-smoothed sands, and we got along by making a swaying, hopping tripod dance forward until I began to give under him, and then, as soon as we could, sitting down. His ankle was, in fact, broken, and he could not put it to the ground without exquisite pain, so that it took us nearly 2 hours to get to the house, and it would have taken longer if his butler-valet had not come out to assist me. They had found motor car and chauffeur smashed, and still at the end of the road near the house, and had been on that side looking for Melmount, or they would have seen us before. For most of that time we were sitting now on turf, now on a chalk border, now on a timber groin, or talking one to the other, with the frankness proper to the intercourse of men of good intent, without reservations or aggressions, in the common, open fashion of contemporary intercourse today, but which then, nevertheless, was the rarest and strangest thing in the world. He, for the most part, talked, but at some shape of a question, I told him, as plainly as I could tell of passions that had for a time become incomprehensible to me, of my murderous pursuit of Nettie and her lover, and how the green vapors overcame me. He watched me with grave eyes and nodded understandingly, And afterwards he asked me brief penetrating questions about my education, my upbringing, my work. There was a deliberation in his manner, brief full pauses that had in them no element of delay. "Yes," he said, "yes, of course, what a fool I have been," and said no more until we had made another of our tripod struggles along the beach. At first I did not see the connection of my story with that self-accusation. "Suppose," he said, panting on the groin, "there had been such a thing as a statesman." He turned to me. "If one had decided all this muddle shall end, if one had taken it, as an artist takes his clay, as a man who builds takes site and stone, and made—" He flung out his big broad hand at the glories of sky and sea and drew a deep breath, "something to fit that setting." He added in explanation, "Then there wouldn't have been such stories as yours at all, you know." "Tell me more about it," he said. "Tell me all about yourself. I feel all these things have passed away, all these things are to be changed forever. But you won't be what you have been from this time forth. All the things that you have done don't matter now. To us, at any rate, they don't matter at all. We have met, who were separated in that darkness behind us. Tell me." "Yes," he said, "and I told my story straight and as frankly as I have told it to you. And there, where those little skerries of weed rock run out to the ebb beyond the headland is Bungalow Village. What did you do with your pistol?" "I left it lying there, among the barley." He glanced at me from under his light eyelashes. "If others feel like you and I," he said, "there'll be a lot of pistols left among the barley today." So we talked, I and that great, strong man, with the love of brothers so plain between us, it needed not a word. Our souls out to one another in stark good faith. Never before had I had anything but a guarded watchfulness for any fellow man. Still I see him upon that wild, desolate beach of the ebb tide. I see him leaning against the shelly buttress of a groin, looking down at the poor drowned sailor whose body we presently found. For we found a newly drowned man who had just chanced to miss this great dawn in which we rejoiced. We found him lying in a pool of water among brown weeds in the dark shadow of the timberings. You must not overrate the horrors of the former days. In those days it was scarcely more common to see death in England than it would be today. This dead man was a sailor from the Rote Adler, a great German battleship that, had we but known it, lay not 4 miles away along the coast amidst ploughed-up mountains of chalk ooze, a torn and battered mass of machinery, wholly submerged in high water, and holding in its interstices 900 drowned brave men, all strong and skillful, all once capable of doing fine things. I remember that boy very vividly. He had been drowned during the anesthesia of the green gas. His fair young face was quiet and calm, but the skin of his chest had been crinkled by scalding water, and his right arm was bent queerly back. Even to this needless death and all its tale of cruelty, beauty, and dignity had come. Everything flowed together to significance as we stood there, I, the ill-clad, cheaply equipped proletarian, and Melmount in his great fur-trimmed coat. He was hot with walking, but he had not thought to remove it, leaning upon the clumsy groins and pitying this poor victim of the war he had helped to make. "Poor lad," he said, "poor lad. A child we blunderers sent to death. Do look at the quiet beauty of that face, that body, to be flung aside like this." I remember that near this dead man's hand a stranded starfish writhed its slowly feeling limbs, struggling back towards the sea. It left grooved traces in the sand. "There must be no more of this," panted Melmount, leaning on my shoulder. "No more of this." But most I recall Melmount, as he talked a little later, sitting upon a great chalk boulder with the sunlight on his big, perspiration-dewed face. He made his resolves. "We must end war," he said, in that full whisper of his. "It is stupidity. With so many people able to read and think, even as it is, there is no need of anything of the sort. Gods, what have we rulers been at? Drowsing like people in a stifling room, too dull and sleepy and too base toward each other for anyone to get up and open the window. What haven't we been at? A great powerful figure, he sits there still in my memory, perplexed and astonished at himself and all things. We must change all this, he repeated, and threw out his broad hands in a powerful gesture against the sea and sky. We have done so weakly, heaven alone knows this. I can see him now, queer giants that he looked on that dawn-lit beach of splendor, the seabirds flying about us and that crumpled death hard by. No bad symbol in his clumsiness and needless heat of the unawakened powers of the former time. I remember it as an integral part of that picture that far away across the sandy stretches, one of those white estate boards I have described stuck up a little askew amidst the yellow-green turf upon the crest of the low cliffs. He talked with a sort of wonder of the former things. Has it ever dawned upon you to imagine the pettiness of every soul concerned in a declaration of war? He asked. He went on as though speech was necessary to make it credible, to describe Laycock, who first gave the horror words at the Cabinet Council, an undersized Oxford prig with a tenoring voice and a garbage of Greek, the sort of little fool who was brought up on the admiration of his elder sisters. All the time lost, he said, I was watching him, thinking what an ass he was to be trusted with men's lives. I might have done better to have thought that of myself. I was doing nothing to prevent it at all. The damned little imbecile was up to his neck in the drama of the thing. He liked to trumpet it out. He goggled round at us. Then it is war, he said. Richover shrugged his shoulders. I made some slight protest and gave in. Afterward, I dreamt of him. What a lot we were, all a little scared at ourselves, all, as it were, instrumental. And it's fools like that lead to things like this. He jerked his head at the dead man nearby us. It will be interesting to know what has happened to the world, this green vapor, queer stuff. But I know what has happened to me. It's conversion. I've always known. But this is being a fool. Talk. I'm going to stop it. He motioned to rise with his clumsy outstretched hands. Stop what? Said I, stepping forward instinctively to help him. War, he said, in his great whisper, putting his big hand on my shoulder, but making no further attempt to arise. I'm going to put an end to war, to any sort of war, and all these things that must end. The world is beautiful, life is great and splendid. We had only to lift up our eyes and see. Think of the glories through which we have been driving, like a herd of swine in a garden place. The color and life, the sounds, the shapes. We have had our jealousies, our quarrels, our ticklish rights, our invincible prejudices, our vulgar enterprise and sluggish timidities. We have chattered and pecked one another and fouled the world, like daws in the temple, like unclean birds in the holy place of God. All my life has been foolishness and pettiness, gross pleasures and mean discretions, all. I'm a meager dark thing in this morning's glow, a penitence, a shame, and but for God's mercy I might have died this night, like that poor lad there, amidst the squalor of my sins. No more of this, no more of this. Whether the whole world has changed or no matters nothing. We too have seen this dawn. He paused. I will arise and go unto my father, he began presently, and will say unto him. His voice died away in an inaudible whisper. His hand tightened painfully on my shoulder, and he rose. Book 2, Chapter 2, The Awakening, Section 1. So the great day came to me, and even as I had awakened, so in that same dawn the whole world awoke. For the whole world of living things had been overtaken by the same tide of insensibility. In an hour at the touch of this new gas in the comet, the shiver of catalytic change had passed about the globe. They say it was the nitrogen in the air, the old azote, that in the twinkling of an eye was changed out of itself, and in an hour or so became a respirable gas, differing indeed from oxygen, but helping and sustaining its action, a bath of strength and healing for nerve and brain. I do not know the precise changes that occurred, nor the names our chemists give them. My work has carried me away from such things. Only this I know, I and all men were renewed. I picture to myself this thing happening in space, a planetary moment, the faint smudge, the slender whirl of meteor drawing nearer to this planet like a ball, like a shaded, rounded ball, floating in the void with its little, nearly impalpable coat of cloud and air, with its dark pools of ocean, its gleaming ridges of land. And as that midge from the void touches it, the transparent gaseous outer shell clouds in an instant green and then slowly clears again. Therefore, for 3 hours or more, we know the minimum time for the change was almost exactly 3 hours, because all the clocks and watches kept going. Everywhere, no man, nor beast, nor bird, nor any living thing that breathes the air stirred at all but lay still. Everywhere on earth that day, in the ears of everyone who breathed, there had been the same humming in the air, the same rush of green vapors, the crepitation, the streaming down of shooting stars, The Hindu had stayed this morning's work in the fields to stare and marvel and fall. The blue-clothed Chinaman fell head foremost athwart his midday bowl of rice. The Japanese merchant came out from some chaffering in his office amazed and presently lay there before his door. The evening gazers by the golden gates were overtaken as they waited for the rising of the great star. This had happened in every city of the world, in every lonely valley, in every home and house and shelter, in every open place. On the high seas, the crowding steamship passengers, eager for any wonder, gaped and marveled, and were suddenly terror-stricken and struggled for the gangways and were overcome. The captain staggered on the bridge and fell. The stoker fell headlong among his coals. The engines throbbed upon their way untended. The fishing craft drove by without a hail, with swaying rudder, heeling and dipping. The great voice of material fate cried halt, and in the midst of the play the actors staggered, dropped, and were still. The figure runs from my pen in New York that everything occurred. Most of the theatrical audiences dispersed, but in two crowded houses the company, fearing a panic, went on playing amidst the gloom, and the people, trained by many a previous disaster, stuck to their seats. There they sat, the back rows only moving a little, and there, in disciplined lines, they drooped and failed, nodded and fell forward or slid down upon the floor. I am told by Parload, though indeed I know nothing of the reasoning on which his confidence rests, that within an hour of the great moment of impact, the first green modification of nitrogen had dissolved and passed away, leaving the air as translucent as ever. The rest of that wonderful interlude was clear. Had any had eyes to see its clearness, in London it was night, but in New York, for example, people were in the full bustle of the evening's enjoyment. In Chicago they were sitting down to dinner, the whole world was abroad. The moonlight must have illuminated the streets and squares littered with crumpled figures, through which such electric cars as had no automatic brakes had plowed on their way, until they were stopped by the fallen bodies. People lay in their dress clothes in dining rooms, restaurants, and staircases, in halls, everywhere, just as they had been overcome. Men gambling, men drinking, thieves lurking in hidden places, sinful couples were caught, to arise with awakened mind and conscience amidst the disorder of their sin. America, the Comet, reached in the full tide of evening life, but Britain lay asleep. But as I have told, Britain did not slumber so deeply that she was in the full tide of what may have been battle and a great victory. Up and down the North Sea her warships swept together like a net about their foes. On land, too, that night was to have decided great issues. The German camps were under arms from Medingen to Markirch. Their infantry columns were lying in swaths like mown hay, in arrested night march on every track between Longuyon and Thiancourt, and between Havrecourt and Donnen. The hills beyond Spencourt were dusted thick with hidden French riflemen. The thin lash of the French skirmishers sprawled out amidst spades and unfinished rifle pits and coils that wrapped about the heads of the German columns, thence along the Vosges watershed and out across the frontier near Belfort, nearly to the Rhine. The Hungarian, the Italian peasant yawned and thought the morning dark, and turned over to fall into a dreamless sleep. The Mohammedan world spread its carpet and was overtaken in prayer. And in Sydney, in Melbourne, in New Zealand, the thing was a fog in the afternoon that scattered the crowd on racecourses and cricket fields, and stopped the unloading of shipping and brought men out from their afternoon rest to stagger and litter the streets. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 2. My thoughts go into the woods and wildernesses and jungles of the world, to the wildlife that shared man's suspension, and I think of 1,000 feral acts interrupted and truncated, as it were frozen, like the frozen words Pantagruel met at sea. Not only men it was that were quieted, all living creatures that breathed the air became insensible, impassive things. Motionless brutes and birds lay amidst the drooping trees and herbage in the universal twilight. The tiger sprawled beside his fresh-struck victim, who bled to death in a dreamless sleep. The very flies came sailing down the air with wings outspread. The spider hung crumpled in his loaded net. Like some gaily painted snowflake, the butterfly drifted to earth and grounded, and was still. And as a queer contrast, one gathers that the fishes in the sea suffered not at all. Speaking of the fishes reminds me of a queer little inset upon that great world dreaming. The odd fate of the crew of the submarine vessel B-94 has always seemed memorable to me. So far as I know, they were the only men alive who never saw that veil of green drawn across the world. All the while that the stillness held above, they were working into the mouth of the Elbe, past the booms and the mines. Very slowly and carefully, a sinister crustacean of steel, explosive crammed along the muddy bottom. They trailed a long clue that was to guide their fellows from the mother ship floating awash outside. Then, in the long channel beyond the forts, they came up at last to mark down their victims and get air. That must have been before the twilight of dawn, for they tell of the brightness of the stars. They were amazed to find themselves not 300 yards from an ironclad that had rushed ashore in the mud, and heeled over with the falling tide. It was a fire amidships, but no one heeded that. No one in all that strange clear silence heeded that. And not only this wrecked vessel, but all the dark ships lying about them. It seemed to their perplexed and startled minds must be full of dead men. Theirs, I think, must have been one of the strangest of all experiences. They were never insensible. At once, and I am told, with a sudden catch of laughter, they began to breathe the new air. None of them has proved a writer. We have no picture of their wonder, no description of what was said. But we know these men were active and awake for an hour and a half at least before the general awakening came. And when at last the Germans stirred and sat up, they found these strangers in possession of their battleship, the submarine carelessly adrift, and the Englishmen, begrimed and weary, but with a sort of furious exultation, still busy in the bright dawn, rescuing insensible enemies from the sinking conflagration. But the thought of certain stokers, the sailors of the submarine failed altogether to save, brings me back to the thread of grotesque horror that runs through all this event, the thread I cannot overlook for all the splendors of human well-being that have come from it. I cannot forget the unguided ships that drove ashore, that went down in disaster with all their sleeping hands, nor how, inland, motor cars rushed to destruction upon the roads, and trains upon the railways kept on in spite of signals, to be found at last by their amazed reviving drivers standing on unfamiliar lines, their fires exhausted, or less luckily, to be discovered by astonished peasants or awakened porters smashed and crumpled up into heaps of smoking, crackling ruin. The foundry fires of the 4 towns still blazed, the smoke of our burnings still denied the sky. Fires burnt indeed the brighter for the change, and spread. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 3. Picture to yourself what happened between the printing and composing of the copy of the new paper that lies before me now. It was the first newspaper that was printed upon earth after the great change. It was pocket-worn and browned, made of a paper no man ever intended for preservation. I found it on the arbor table in the inn garden while I was waiting for Nettie and Verrall, before that last conversation of which I have presently to tell. As I look at it all, that scene comes back to me, and Nettie stands there in her white raiment against a blue-green background of sunlit garden, scrutinizing my face as I read. It is so frayed that the sheet cracks along the folds and comes to pieces in my hands. It lies upon my desk, a dead souvenir of the dead ages of the world, of the ancient passions of my heart. I know we discussed its news, but for the life of me I cannot recall what we said. Only I remember that Nettie said very little, and that Verrall for a time read it over my shoulder, and I did not like him to read over my shoulder. The document before me must have helped us through the first awkwardness of that meeting. But of all that we said and did, then I must tell in a later chapter. It is easy to see the new paper had been set up overnight, and then large pieces of the stereo plates replaced subsequently. I do not know enough of the old methods of printing to know precisely what happened. The thing gives one an impression of large pieces of type having been cut away and replaced by fresh blocks. There is something very rough and ready about it all, and the new portions of print darker and more smudgingly than the old, except toward the left where they have missed ink and indented. A friend of mine who knows something of the old typography has suggested to me that the machinery actually in use for the new paper was damaged that night, and that on the morning of the change Banghurst borrowed a neighboring office, perhaps in financial dependence upon him, to print in. The outer pages belong entirely to the old period. The only parts of the paper that had undergone alteration are the 2 middle leaves, Here we found set forth in a curious little 4-column oblong of print what has happened. This cut across the column, with scarce headings beginning. Great naval battle now in progress, the fate of 2 empires in the balance, report loss of 2 more. These things, one gathered, were beneath notice now. Probably it was guesswork and fabricated news in the first instance. It is curious to piece together the worn and frayed fragments and reread this discolored first intelligence of the new epoch. The simple clear statements in the replaced portion of the paper impressed me at the time. I remember, as bald and strange in that framework of shouting bad English, now they seemed like the voice of a sane man amidst a vast fated violence. But they witnessed to the prompt recovery of London from the gas, the new, swift energy of rebound in that huge population. I am surprised now, as I reread, to note how much research, experiment, and induction must have been accomplished in the day that elapsed before the paper was printed. And that is, by the way, as I sit and muse over this partly carbonized sheet, that same curious remote vision comes again to me that quickened in my mind that morning, a vision of those newspaper offices I have already described to you going through the crisis. The catalytic wave must have caught the place in full swing, in its nocturnal high fever, indeed in a quite exceptional state of fever, with what the comet and the war, and more particularly with the war. Very probably the change crept into the office imperceptibly amidst the noise and shouting, and the glare of electric light that made the night atmosphere in that place. Even the green flashes may have passed unobserved there. The preliminary descending trails of green vapor seemed no more than unseasonable drifting wisps of London fog. In those days, London, even in summer, was not safe against dark fogs, and then at the last the change poured in and overtook them. If there was any warning at all for them, it must have been a sudden, universal tumult in the street, and then a much more universal quiet. They could have had no other intimation. There was no time to stop the presses before the main development of green vapor had overwhelmed everyone. It must have folded about them, tumbled them to the earth, masked and stilled them. My imagination is always curiously stirred by the thought of that, because I suppose it is the first picture I succeed in making for myself of what had happened to the towns. It has never quite lost its strangeness for me that when the change came, machinery went on working. I don't precisely know why that should have seemed so strange to me, but it did, and still to a certain extent does. One is so accustomed, I suppose, to regard machinery as an extension of human personality that the extent of its autonomy the change displayed came as a shock to me. The electric lights, for example, hazy green haloed nebulas, must have gone on burning at least for a time. Amidst the thickening darkness, the huge presses must have roared on, printing, folding, throwing aside copy after copy of that fabricated battle report with its quarter column of scare headlines, and all the place must have still quivered and throbbed with the familiar roar of the engines. And this, though, no men ruled there at all any more. Here and there, beneath that thickening fog, the crumpled or outstretched forms of men lay still. A wonderful thing that must have seemed, had any man had any chance, the power of resistance to the vapor, and could he have walked amidst it. And soon the machines must have exhausted their feed of ink and paper and thumped and banged and rattled emptily amidst the general quiet. Then I suppose the furnaces failed for want of stoking. The steam pressure fell in the pistons, the machinery slacked. The lights burnt dim and came and went with the ebb of energy from the power station. Who can tell precisely the sequence of these things now? And then, you know, amidst the weakening and terminating noises of men, the green vapor cleared and vanished. In an hour indeed it was gone, and it may be a breeze stirred and blew and went about the earth. The noises of life were all dying away, but some there were that abated nothing, that sounded triumphantly amidst the universal ebb. To a heedless world the church towers tolled out 2 and then 3. Clocks ticked and chimed everywhere about the earth to deafened ears. And then came the first flush of morning, the first rustlings of the revival. Perhaps in that office the filaments of the lamps were still glowing. The machinery was still pulsing weakly when the crumpled, booted heaps of cloth became man again and began to stir and stare. The chapel of the printers was no doubt shocked to find itself asleep. Amidst that dazzling dawn, the new paper woke to wonder, stood up, and blinked at its amazing self. The clocks of the city churches, one pursuing another, struck 4. The staffs, crumpled and disheveled, but with a strange refreshment in their veins, stood about the damaged machinery, marveling and questioning. The editor read his overnight headlines with incredulous laughter. There was much involuntary laughter that morning. Outside, the mailmen patted the necks and rubbed the knees of their awakening horses. Then you know, slowly and with much conversation and doubt, they set about to produce the paper. Imagine those bemused, perplexed people, carried on by the inertia of their old occupations, and doing their best with an enterprise that had suddenly become altogether extraordinary and irrational. They worked amidst questionings and yet light-heartedly. At every stage there must have been interruptions for discussion. The paper only got down to Minton 5 days late. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 4. Then let me give you a vivid little impression I received of a certain prosaic person, a grocer named Wiggins, and how he passed through the change. I heard this man's story in the post office at Minton, when, in the afternoon of the first day, I bethought me to telegraph to my mother. The place was also a grocer's shop, and I found him and the proprietor talking as I went in. They were trade competitors, and Wiggins had just come across the street to break the hostile silence of a score of years. The sparkle of the change was in their eyes, their slightly flushed cheeks, their more elastic gestures spoke of new physical influences that had invaded their beings. It did us no good, all our hatred, Mr. Wiggins said to me, explaining the emotion of their encounter. It did our customers no good, I've come to tell him that. You bear that in mind, young man, if you ever come to have a shop of your own. It was a sort of stupid bitterness that possessed us, and I can't make out we didn't see it before in that light. Not so much downright wickedness it wasn't as stupidity. A stupid jealousy, think of it. 2 human beings without a stone's throw, who have not spoken for 20 years, hardening our hearts against each other. I can't think how we came to such a state, Mr. Wiggins, said the other, packing tea into pound packets out of mere habit as he spoke. It was wicked pride and obstinacy. We knew it was foolish all the time. I stood affixing the adhesive stamp to my telegram. Only the other morning, he went on to me, I was cutting French eggs, selling at a loss to do it. He'd marked down with a great staring ticket to 9 pence a dozen. I saw it as I went past. Here's my answer. He indicated a ticket, 8 pence a dozen, same as sold elsewhere for 9 pence. A whole penny down, bang off, just a touch above cost. If that, and even then. He leant over the counter to say impressively, not the same eggs. Now what people in their senses would do things like that, said Mr. Wiggins. I sent my telegram, the proprietor dispatched it for me, and while he did so I fell exchanging experiences with Mr. Wiggins. He knew no more than I did then the nature of the change that had come over things. He had been alarmed by the green flashes, he said, so much so that after watching for a time from his bedroom window, he got up and hastily dressed and made his family get up also, so that they might be ready for the end. He made them put on their Sunday clothes. They all went out into the garden together, their minds divided between admiration of the gloriousness of the spectacle and a great and growing awe. They were dissenters, very religious people out of business hours, and it seemed to them in those last magnificent moments that, after all, science must be wrong and the fanatics were right. With the green vapors came conviction, and they prepared to meet their God. This man, you must understand, was a common-looking man, in his shirt sleeves and with an apron about his paunch, and he told his story in an Anglian accent that sounded mean and clipped to my Staffordshire ears. He told his story with a thought of pride, and as it were incidentally, and yet he gave me a vision of something heroic. These people did not run hither and thither as many people did. These 4 simple, common people stood beyond their back door in their garden pathway between the gooseberry bushes, with the terrors of their God and his judgments closing in upon them, swiftly and wonderfully. And there they began to sing. There they stood, father and mother and 2 daughters, chanting out stoutly, but no doubt a little flatly after the manner of their kind. In Zion's hope abiding, my soul in triumph sings, until one by one they fell and lay still. The postmaster had heard them in the gathering darkness, in Zion's hope abiding. It was the most extraordinary thing in the world to hear this flushed and happy-eyed man telling that story of his recent death, It did not seem at all possible to have happened in the last 12 hours. It was minute and remote, these people who went singing through the darkling to their god. It was like a scene shown to me, very small and very distinctly painted in a locket. But that effect was not confined to this particular thing. A vast number of things that had happened before the coming of the comet had undergone the same transfiguring reduction. Other people, too, I have learnt since, had the same illusion, a sense of enlargement. It seemed to me even now that the little dark creature who had stormed across England in pursuit of Nettie and her lover must have been about an inch high, that all the previous life of ours had been an ill-lit marionette show acted in the twilight. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 5. The figure of my mother always comes into my conception of the change. I remembered how one day she confessed herself. She had been very sleepless that night, she said, and took the reports of the falling stars for shooting. There had been rioting in Clayton, and all through Swathing Leah all day, and so she got out of bed to look. She had a dim sense that I was in all such troubles. But she was not looking when the change came. When I saw the stars a-raining down, dear, she said, and thought of you out in it, I thought there'd be no harm in saying a prayer for you, dear. I thought you wouldn't mind that. And so I got another of my pictures, the green vapors come and go, and there by her patched coverlet that dear old woman kneels and droops, still clasping her poor gnarled hands in the attitude of prayer to it, for me. Through the meager curtains and blinds of the flawed refracting window, I see the stars above the chimneys fade. The pale light of dawn creeps into the sky, and her candle flares and dies. That also went with me through the stillness, that silent kneeling figure, that frozen prayer to God to shield me, silent in a silent world, rushing through the emptiness of space. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 6. With the dawn, that awakening went about the earth. I have told how it came to me and how I walked in wonder through the transfigured cornfields of Championbury. It came to everyone. Near me, and, for the time, clear forgotten by me, Verrall and Nettie woke near one another. Each heard before all other sounds the other's voice amidst the stillness and the light, and the scattered people who had run to and fro and fallen on the beach of Bungalow Village awoke. The sleeping villagers of Minton started, and sat up in that unwonted freshness and newness. The contorted figures in the garden, with all the hymns still upon their lips, stirred amidst the flowers and touched each other timidly, and thought of paradise. My mother found herself crouched against the bed and rose with the glad, invincible conviction of accepted prayer. Already, when it came to us, the soldiers, crowded between the lines of dusty poplars along the road to Allermont, were chatting and sharing coffee with the French riflemen, who had hailed them from their carefully hidden pits among the vineyards up the slopes of Beauville. A certain perplexity had come to these marksmen, who had dropped asleep tensely, ready for the rocket that should wake the whir and rattle of their magazines. At the sight and sound of the stir and human confusion in the roadway below, it had come to each man individually that he could not shoot. One conscript, at least, has told his story of his awakening, and how curious he thought the rifle there beside him in his pit, and how he took it on his knees to examine. Then, as his memory of its purpose grew clearer, he dropped the thing, and stood with a kind of joyful horror at the crime escaped, to look more closely at the men he was to have assassinated. Brave types, he thought, they looked for such a fate. The summoning rocket never flew. Below, the men did not fall into ranks again, but sat by the roadside, or stood in groups talking, discussing with a novel incredulity the ostensible causes of the war. The Emperor, said they. Oh, nonsense. We're civilized men. Get someone else for this job. Where's the coffee? The officers held their own horses and talked to the men frankly, regardless of discipline. Some Frenchmen out of the rifle pits came sauntering down the hill. Others stood doubtfully, rifles still in hand. Curious faces scanned these latter. Little arguments sprang as, shoot at us? Nonsense. They're respectable French citizens. There is a picture of it all, very bright and detailed in the morning light, in the battle gallery amidst the ruins at Old Nancy. And one sees the old-world uniform of the soldier, the odd caps and belts and boots, the ammunition belt, the water bottle, the sort of tourist pack the men carried. A queer, elaborate equipment. The soldiers had awakened one by one, first one and then another. I wonder sometimes whether perhaps if the two armies had come awake in an instant, the battle by mere habit and inertia might not have begun. But the men who waked first sat up, looked about them in astonishment, had time to think a little. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 7. Everywhere there was laughter, everywhere tears. Men and women in the common life, finding themselves suddenly lit and exalted, capable of doing what had hitherto been impossible, capable of doing what had hitherto been irresistible, happy, hopeful, unselfishly energetic, rejected altogether the supposition that this was merely a change in the blood and material texture of life. They denied the bodies God had given them, as once the upper Nile savages struck out their canine teeth because these made them like the beasts. They declared that this was the coming of a spirit, and nothing else would satisfy their need for explanations. And in a sense the spirit came. The great revival sprang directly from the change, the last, the deepest, widest, and most enduring of all the vast inundations of religious emotion that go by that name. But indeed it differed essentially from its innumerable predecessors. The former revivals were a phase of fever. This was the first movement of health. It was altogether quieter, more intellectual, more private, more religious than any of those others. In the old time, and more especially in the Protestant countries where the things of religion were outspoken, and the absence of confession and well-trained priests made religious states of emotion explosive and contagious, revivalism upon various scales was a normal phase in the religious life. Revivals were always going on. Now a little disturbance of consciences in a village, now an evening of emotion in a mission room, now a great storm that swept the continent, and now an organized effort that came to town with bands and banners and handbills and motor cars for the saving of souls. Never at any time did I take part in, nor was I attracted by any of these movements. My nature, although passionate, was too critical, or skeptical if you like, for it amounts to the same thing, and shy to be drawn into these whirls. But on several occasions Parload and I sat, scoffing, but nevertheless disturbed in the back seats of revivalist meetings. I saw enough of them to understand their nature, and I am not surprised to learn now that before the comet came, all about the world, even among savages, even among cannibals, these same, or at any rate closely similar, periodic upheavals went on. The world was stifling, it was in a fever, and these phenomena were neither more nor less than the instinctive struggle of the organism against the ebb of its powers, the clogging of its veins, the limitations of its life. Invariably, these revivals followed periods of sordid and restricted living. Men obeyed their base immediate motives until the world grew unendurably bitter. Some disappointment, some thwarting lit up for them, darkly indeed, but yet enough for distinct visions. The crowded squalor, the dark enclosure of life. A sudden disgust with the insensate smallness of the old world way of living, a realization of sin, a sense of the unworthiness of all individual things, a desire for something comprehensive, sustaining, something greater, for wider communions and less habitual things filled them. Their souls, which were shaped for wider issues, cried out suddenly amidst the petty interest, the narrow prohibitions of life, not this, not this. A great passion to escape from the jealous prison of themselves, an inarticulate stammering, weeping passion shook them. I remember how once in Clayton Calvinistic Methodist chapel I saw, his spotty fat face strangely distorted under the flickering gas flares, old Pallet, the ironmonger repent. He went to the form of repentance, a bench reserved for such exhibitions, and slobbered out his sorrow and disgust for some sexual indelicacy. He was a widower, and I can see now how his loose, fat body quivered and swayed with his grief. He poured it out to 500 people, from whom in common times he hid his every thought and purpose, and it is a fact, it shows where reality lay, that we two youngsters laughed not at all at that blubbering grotesque. We did not even think the distant shadow of a smile. We two sat grave and intent, perhaps wondering. Only afterward, and with an effort, did we scoff. Those old-time revivals were, I say, the convulsive movements of a body that suffocates. They are the clearest manifestations, from before the change of a sense in all men that things were not right, but they were too often but momentary illuminations. Their force spent itself in incoordinated shouting, gesticulations, tears. They were but flashes of outlook. Disgust of narrow life, of all baseness, took shape in narrowness and baseness. The quickened soul ended the night a hypocrite. Prophets disputed for precedence. Seductions, it is altogether indisputable, were frequent among penitents. And Ananias went home converted, and returned with a falsified gift, and it was almost universal that the converted should be impatient and immoderate, scornful of reason, and a choice of expedience, opposed to balance, skill, and knowledge, incontinently full of grace, like thin old wineskins overfilled. They felt they must burst if once they came into contact with hard fact and sane direction. So the former revivals spent themselves, but the great revival did not spend itself, but grew to be, for the majority of Christendom at least, the permanent expression of the change. For many, it has taken the shape of an outright declaration that this was the second advent. It is not for me to discuss the validity of that suggestion, for nearly all it has amounted to an enduring broadening of all the issues of life. Book 2, Chapter 2, Section 8. One irrelevant memory comes back to me, irrelevant, and yet by some subtle trick of quality it summarizes the change for me. It is the memory of a woman's very beautiful face, a woman with a flushed face and tear-bright eyes who went by me without speaking, wrapped in some secret purpose. I passed her when in the afternoon of the first day, struck by a sudden remorse, I went down to Menton to send a telegram to my mother telling her all was well with me. Whither this woman went I did not know, nor whence she came. I never saw her again, and only her face, glowing with that new and luminous resolve, stands out for me. But that expression was the world's. Book 2, Chapter 3, The Cabinet Council. Section 1. And what a strange, unprecedented thing was that cabinet council at which I was present, the council that was held 2 days later in Melmount's bungalow, and which convened the conference to frame the constitution of the world state. I was there because it was convenient for me to stay with Melmount. I had nowhere to go particularly, and there was no one at his bungalow, to which his broken ankle confined him, but a secretary and a valet to help him to begin his share of the enormous labors that evidently lay before the rulers of the world. I wrote shorthand, and as there was not even a phonograph available, I went in so soon as his ankle has been dressed, and sat at his desk to write at his dictation. It is characteristic of the odd slackness that went with the spasmodic violence of the old epoch that the secretary could not use shorthand and that there was no telephone whatever in the place. Every message had to be taken to the village post office in that grocer's shop at Minton's, half a mile away. So I sat in the back of Melmont's room. His desk had been thrust aside and made such memoranda as were needed. At that time his room seemed to me the most beautifully furnished in the world, and I could identify now the vivid cheerfulness of the chintz of the sofa on which the great statesman lay just in front of me, the fine, rich paper, the red sealing wax, the silver equipage of the desk I used. I know now that my presence in that room was a strange and remarkable thing. The open door, even the coming and going of Parker, the secretary, innovations. In the old days, a cabinet council was a secret conclave. Secrecy and furtiveness were in the texture of all public life. In the old days, everybody was always keeping something back from somebody, being wary and cunning, prevaricating, misleading. For the most part, for no reason at all. Almost unnoticed, that secrecy had dropped out of life. I closed my eyes and see those men again, hear their deliberating voices. First I see them a little diffusely in the cold explicitness of daylight, and then concentrated and drawn together amidst the shadow and mystery about shaded lamps. Integral to this and very clear is the memory of biscuit crumbs and a drop of spilt water, that at first stood shining upon and then sank into the green tablecloth. I remember particularly the figure of Lord Adasham. He came to the bungalow a day before the others because he was Melmount's personal friend. Let me describe this statesman to you, this one of the 15 men who made the last war. He was the youngest member of the government and an altogether pleasant and sunny man of 40. He had a clear profile to his clean gray face, a smiling eye, a friendly, careful voice upon his thin, clean-shaven lips, an easy, disabusing manner. He had the perfect quality of a man who had fallen easily into a place prepared for him. He had the temperament of what we used to call a philosopher, an indifferent, that is to say. The change had caught him at his weekend recreation, fly fishing. And indeed, he said, I remember, that he recovered to find himself with his head within a yard of the water's brim. In times of crisis, Lord Adisham invariably went fly fishing at the weekend to keep his mind in tone. And when there was no crisis then, there was nothing he liked so much to do as fly fishing, and so, of course, as there was nothing to prevent it, he fished. He came resolved, among other things, to give up fly fishing altogether. I was present when he came to Melmount and heard him say as much, and by a more naive route it was evident that he had arrived at the same scheme of intention as my master. I left them to talk, but afterward I came back to take down their long telegrams to their coming colleagues. He was, no doubt, as profoundly affected as Melmont's by the change, but his tricks of civility and irony and acceptable humor had survived the change, and he expressed his altered attitude, his expanded emotions, in a quaint modification of the old-time man-of-the-world style, with excessive moderation, with a trained horror of the enthusiasm that swayed him. These 15 men who ruled the British Empire were curiously unlike anything I had expected, and I watched them intently whenever my services were not in request. They made a peculiar class at that time, these English politicians and statesmen, a class that has now completely passed away. In some respects, they were unlike the statesmen of any other region of the world, and I do not find that any really adequate account remains of them. Perhaps you are a reader of the old books. If so, you will then find them rendered with a note of hostile exaggeration by Dickens in Bleak House, with a mingling of gross flattery and keen ridicule by Disraeli, who ruled among them accidentally by misunderstanding them and pleasing the court, and all their assumptions are set forth portentously. Perhaps, but truthfully, so far as people of the permanent official class saw them, in the novels of Mrs. Humphrey Ward. All these books are still in this world and at the disposal of the curious, and in addition the philosopher Bagehot and the picturesque historian Macaulay give something of their method to thinking. The novelist Thackeray skirts the seamy side of their social life, and there are some good passages of irony, personal descriptions, and reminiscence to be found in the 20th century Garner, from the pens of such writers, for example, as Sidney Lowe. But a picture of them as a whole is wanting. Then they were too near and too great. Now, very rapidly, they have become incomprehensible. We common people of the old time based our conception of our statesmen almost entirely on the caricatures that formed the most powerful weapon in political controversy. Like almost every main feature of the old condition of things, these caricatures were an unanticipated development. They were a sort of parasitic outgrowth from which had finally altogether replaced the thin and vague aspirations of the original democratic ideals. They presented not only the personalities who led our public life, but the most sacred structural conceptions of that life, in ludicrous, vulgar, and dishonorable aspects that in the end came near to destroying entirely all grave and honorable emotion or motive toward the state. The state of Britain was represented nearly always by a red-faced, purse-proud farmer with an enormous belly, that fine dream of freedom, the United States, by a cunning, lean-faced rascal in striped trousers and a blue coat. The chief ministers of state were pickpockets, washerwomen, clowns, whales, asses, elephants, and what-not, and issues that affected the welfare of millions of men were dressed and judged like a rally in some idiotic pantomime. A tragic war in South Africa that wrecked many thousand homes, impoverished 2 whole lands, and brought death and disablement to 50,000 men, was presented as a quite comical quarrel between a violent queer being named Chamberlain, with an eyeglass, an orchid, and a short temper, and old Kruger, an obstinate and very cunning old man in a shocking bad hat. The conflict was carried through in a mood sometimes of brutish irritability and sometimes of lax slovenliness. The merry peculator plied his trade congenially in that asinine squabble, and behind these fooleries and masked them marched fate, until at last the clowning of the booth opened and revealed hunger and suffering, brands burning and swords and shame. These men had come to fame and power in that atmosphere, and to me that day there was the oddest suggestion in them of actors who have suddenly laid aside grotesque and foolish parts. The paint was washed from their faces, the posing put aside. Even the presentation was not frankly grotesque and degrading, it was entirely misleading. When I read of Laycock, for example, there arises a picture of a large, active, if a little wrong-headed intelligence in a compact, heroic body, emitting that Goliath speech of his that did so much to precipitate hostilities. It tallies not at all with the stammering, high-pitched, slightly bald, and very conscience-stricken personage I saw, nor with Melmount's contemptuous first description of him. I doubt if the world at large will ever get a proper vision of those men as they were before the change. Each year they pass more and more incredibly beyond our intellectual sympathy. Our estrangement cannot indeed rob them of their portion in the past, but it will rob them of any effect of reality. The whole of their history becomes more and more foreign, more and more like some queer barbaric drama played in a forgotten tongue. There they strut through their weird metamorphosis of caricature, those premiers and presidents, their height preposterously exaggerated by political buskins, their faces covered by great resonant inhuman masks, their voices couched in the foolish idiom of public utterance, disguised beyond any semblance to sane humanity, roaring and squeaking through the public press. There it stands, this incomprehensible, faded show, a thing left on one side and now still and deserted by any interest, its many emptinesses as inexplicable now as the cruelties of medieval Venice, the theology of old Byzantium. And they ruled and influenced the lives of nearly a quarter of mankind. These politicians, their clownish conflicts swayed the world, made mirth perhaps, made excitement, and permitted infinite misery. I saw these men quickened indeed by the change, but still wearing the queer clothing of the old time, the manners and conventions of the old time. If they had disengaged themselves from the outlook of the old time, they had still to refer back to it constantly as a starting point. My refreshed intelligence was equal to that, so that I think I did indeed see them. There was Gorrell Browning, the Chancellor of the Duchy. I remember him as a big, round-faced man, the essential vanity and foolishness of whose expression, whose habit of voluminous, platitudinous speech triumphed absurdly, once or twice over the roused spirit within. He struggled with it, he burlesqued himself and laughed. Suddenly he said simply, intensely, it was a moment for everyone of clean, clear pain. I have been a vain and self-indulgent and presumptuous old man. I am of little use here. I have given myself to politics and intrigues, and life is gone from me. Then for a long time he sat still. There was Carton, the Lord Chancellor, a white-faced man with understanding. He had a heavy, shaven face that might have stood among the busts of the Caesars, a slow, elaborating voice with self-indulgent, slightly oblique and triumphant lips, and a momentary, voluntary, humorous twinkle. We have to forgive, he said. We have to forgive, even ourselves. These two were at the top corner of the stable, so that I saw their faces well. Madgett, the Home Secretary, a smaller man with wrinkled eyebrows and a frozen smile on his thin, wry mouth, came next to Carton. He contributed little to the discussion save intelligent comments, and when the electric lights above glowed out, the shadows deepened queerly in his eye sockets and gave him the quizzical expression of an ironical goblin. Next him was that great peer, the Earl of Richover, whose self-indulgent indolence had accepted the role of the 20th century British Roman patrician of culture, who had divided his time almost equally between his jockeys, politics, and the composition of literary studies in the key of his role. We have done nothing worth doing, he said. As for me, I have cut a figure. He reflected, no doubt, on his ample patrician years, on the fine great houses that had been his setting, the teeming race-courses that had roared his name, the enthusiastic meetings he had fed with fine hopes, the futile Olympian beginnings. I have been a fool, he said compactly. They heard him in a sympathetic and respectful silence. Gurker, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was partially occulted, so far as I was concerned, by the back of Lord Adisham. Ever and again, Gurker protruded into the discussion, swaying forward a deep, throaty voice, a big nose, a coarse mouth with a drooping, everted lower lip, eyes peering amidst folds and wrinkles. He made his confession for his race. We Jews, he said, have gone through the system of this world, creating nothing, consolidating many things, destroying much. Our racial self-conceit has been monstrous. We seem to have used our ample coarse intellectuality for no other purpose than to develop and master and maintain the convention of property, to turn life into a sort of mercantile chess and spend our winnings grossly. We have had no sense of service to mankind. Beauty, which is Godhead, we made it a possession. These men and these sayings particularly remain in my memory. Perhaps indeed I wrote them down at the time, but that I do not now remember. How Sir Digby Privet, Revel, Markheimer, and the others sat I do not now recall. They came in as voices, interruptions, imperfectly assigned comments. One got a queer impression that except perhaps for Gurker or Revel, these men had not particularly wanted the power they held, had desired to do nothing very much in the positions they had secured. They had found themselves in the cabinet, and until this moment of illumination they had not been ashamed, but they had made no ungentlemanly fuss about the matter. 8 of that 15 came from the same school, had gone through an entirely parallel education, some Greek linguistics, some elementary mathematics, some emasculated science, a little history, a little reading in the silent or timidly orthodox English literature of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. All 8 had imbibed the same dull, gentlemanly tradition of behavior, essentially boyish, unimaginative, with neither keen swords nor art in it, a tradition apt to slobber into sentiment at a crisis and make a great virtue of a simple duty rather clumsily done. None of these 8 had made any real experiments with life. They had lived in blinkers. They had been passed from nurse to governess, from governess to preparatory school, from Eton to Oxford, from Oxford to the politico-social routine. Even their vices and lapses had been according to certain conceptions of good form. They had all gone to the races surreptitiously from Eton, and all cut up to town from Oxford to see life, music hall life, had all come to heel again. Now suddenly they discovered their limitations. "What are we to do?" asked Melmount. "We have awakened this empire in our hands. I know this will seem the most fabulous of all the things I have to tell of the old order, but indeed, I saw it with my eyes, I heard it with my ears. It is a fact that this group of men who constituted the government of 1/5 of the habitable land of the earth, who ruled over 1 million of armed men, who had such navies as mankind had never seen before, whose empire of nations, tongues, peoples still dazzles in these greater days, had no common idea whatever of what they meant to do with the world. They had been a government for 3 long years, and before the change came to them, it had never even occurred to them that it was necessary to have no common idea. There was no common idea at all. That great empire was no more than a thing adrift, an aimless thing that ate and drank and slept and bore arms, and was inordinately proud of itself because it had chanced to happen. It had no plan, no intention. It meant nothing at all. And the other great empires adrift, perilously adrift like marine mines, were in the self-same case. Absurd as a British cabinet council must seem to you now, it was no whit more absurd than the controlling ganglion, autocratic council, president's committee, or what not, of each of its blind rivals. Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 2. I remember as one thing that struck me very forcibly at the time, the absence of any discussion, any difference of opinion about the broad principles of our present state. These men had lived hitherto in a system of conventions and acquired motives, loyalty to a party, loyalty to various secret agreements and understandings, loyalty to the crown. They had all been capable of the keenest attention to precedents, all capable of the most complete suppression of subversive doubts and inquiries. All had their religious emotions under perfect control. They had seemed protected by invisible but impenetrable barriers from all the heady and destructive speculations, the socialistic, republican, and communistic theories that one may still trace through the literature of the last days of the Comet. But now it was as if the very moment of the awakening, those barriers and defenses had vanished, as if the green vapors had washed through their minds and dissolved and swept away 100 once rigid boundaries and obstacles. They had admitted and assimilated at once all that was good and the ill-dressed propagandas that had clamored so vehemently and vainly at the doors of their minds in the former days. It was exactly like the awakening from an absurd and limiting dream. They had come out together naturally and inevitably upon the broad daylight platform of obvious and reasonable agreement upon which we and all the order of our world now stand. Let me try to give the chief things that had vanished from their minds. There was first the ancient system of ownership that made such an extraordinary tangle of our administration of the land upon which we lived. In the old time, no one believed in that as either just or ideally convenient, but everyone accepted it. The community which lived upon the land was supposed to have waived its necessary connection with the land, except in certain limited instances of highway and common. All the rest of the land was cut up in the maddest way into patches and oblongs and triangles of various sizes between 100 square miles and a few acres, and placed under the nearly absolute government of a series of administrators called landowners. They owned the land almost as a man now owns his hat. They bought it and sold it and cut it up like cheese or ham. They were free to ruin it or leave it waste, or erect upon it horrible and devastating eyesores. If the community needed a road or a tramway, if it wanted a town or a village in any position, nay, even if it wanted to go to and fro, it had to do so by exorbitant treaties with each of the monarchs whose territory was involved. No man could find foothold on the face of the earth until he had paid toll and homage to one of them. They had practically no relations and no duties to the nominal, municipal, or national government, amidst whose larger areas their own dominions lay. This sounds, I know, like a lunatic's dream, but mankind was that lunatic, and not only in the old countries of Europe and Asia, where this system had arisen out of the rational delegation of local control to territorial magnates, who had, in the universal baseness of those times, at last altogether evaded and escaped their duties, did it obtain, but the new countries, as we call them then, the United States of America, the Cape Colony, Australia, and New Zealand, spent much of the 19th century in the frantic giving away of land forever to any casual person who would take it. Was there coal, was there petroleum or gold, was there rich soil or harborage, or the site for a fine city, these obsessed and witless governments cried out for scramblers, and a stream of shabby, tricky, and violent adventurers set out to found a new section of the landed aristocracy of the world. After a brief century of hope and pride, the great Republic of the United States of America, the hope, as it was deemed of mankind, became for the most part a drifting crowd of landless men, landlords and railway lords, food lords, for the land is food, and mineral lords ruled its life, gave it universities as one gave coins to a mendicant, and spent its resources upon such vain, tawdry, and foolish luxuries as the world had never seen before. Here was a thing none of these statesmen before the change would have regarded as anything but the natural order of the world, which not one of them now regarded as anything but the mad and vanished illusion of a period of dementia. And as it was with the question of the land, so it was also with 100 other systems and institutions and complicated and disingenuous factors of the life of man. They spoke of trade, and I realized for the first time there could be buying and selling that was no loss to any man. They spoke of industrial organization, and one saw it under captains who sought no base advantages. The haze of old associations, of personal entanglements and habitual recognitions had been dispelled from every stage and process of the social training of men. Things long hidden appeared discovered with an amazing clearness and nakedness. These men who had awakened laughed dissolvent laughs, and the old muddle of schools and colleges, books and traditions, the old fumbling, half-figurative, half-formal teaching of the churches, the complex of weakening and confusing suggestions and hints, amidst which the pride and honor of adolescence doubted and stumbled and fell, became nothing but a curious and pleasantly faded memory. There must be a common training of the young, said Richover, a frank initiation. We have not so much educated them as hidden things from them and set traps. And it might have been so easy. It can all be done so easily. That hangs in my memory as the refrain of that council. It can all be done so easily. But when they said it then, it came to my ears with a quality of enormous refreshment and power. It can all be done so easily, given frankness, given courage. Time was when those platitudes had the freshness and wonder of a gospel. In this enlarged outlook, the war with the Germans, that mythical, heroic, armed female Germany, had vanished from men's imaginations, was a mere exhausted episode. A truce had already been arranged by Melmount, and these ministers, after some marveling reminiscences, set aside the matter of peace as a mere question of particular arrangements. The whole scheme of the world's government had become fluid and provisional in their minds. In small details, as in great, the unanalyzable tangle of wards and vestries, districts and municipalities, counties, states, boards and nations, the interlacing, overlapping, and conflicting authorities, the felt of little interests and claims, in which an innumerable and insatiable multitude of lawyers, agents, managers, bosses, organizers, lived like fleas in a dirty old coat, the web of the conflicts, jealousies, heated patchings up and jobbings apart, of the old order. They flung it all on one side. "What are the new needs?" said Melmount. "This muddle is too rotten to handle. We're beginning again. Let us begin afresh." Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 3. Let us begin afresh. This piece of obvious common sense seemed then to me extinct with courage, the noblest of words. My heart went out to him as he spoke. It was indeed that day as vague as it was valiant. We did not at all see the forms of what we were thus beginning. All that we saw was the clear inevitableness that the old order should end. And then, in a little space of time, mankind in halting but effectual brotherhood was moving out to make its world anew. Those early years, those first and second decades of the new epoch, were in their daily detail a time of rejoicing toil. One saw chiefly one's own share in that, and little of the whole. It is only now that I look back at it all from these ripe years, from this high tower, that I see the dramatic sequence of its changes, see the cruel old confusions of the ancient time become clarified, simplified, and dissolve and vanish away. Where is that old world now? Where is London, that somber city of smoke and drifting darkness, full of the deep roar and haunting music of disorder, with its oily, shining, mud-rimmed, barge-crowded river, its black pinnacles and blackened dome, its sad wildernesses of smut-grayed houses, its myriads of draggled prostitutes, its millions of hurrying clerks? The very leaves upon its trees were foul with greasy black defilements, whereas lime-white Paris, with its green and disciplined foliage, its hard, unflinching tastefulness, its smartly organized viciousness, and the myriad of workers, noisily shod, streaming over the bridges in a gray, cold light of dawn. Where is New York, the high city of clangor and infuriated energy, wind-swept and competition-swept, its huge buildings jostling one another and straining ever upward for a place in the sky, the fallen pitilessly overshadowed? Where are its lurking corners of heavy and costly luxury, the shameful bludgeoning bribing voice of its ill-ruled underways, and all the gaunt extravagant ugliness of its strenuous life? And where now is Philadelphia, with its innumerable small and isolated homes, and Chicago, with its interminable blood-stained stockyards, its polyglot underworld of furious discontent? All these vast cities have given away and gone, even as my native potteries in the Black Country have gone, and the lives that were caught, crippled, starved, and maimed amidst their labyrinths, their forgotten and neglected maladjustments, and their vast, inhuman, ill-conceived industrial machinery have escaped to life. Those cities of growth and accident are altogether gone. Never a chimney smokes about our world today, and the sound of the weeping of children who toiled and hungered, the dull despair of overburdened women, the noise of brute quarrels in alleys, all shameful pleasures, and the ugly grossness of wealthy pride have gone with them, with the utter change in our life. As I look back into the past, I see a vast exultant dust of housebreaking and removal rise up into the clear air that followed the hour of the green vapors. I live again the year of tents, the year of scaffolding, and like the triumph of a new theme in a piece of music, the great cities of our new days arise. Come Caerleon and Armidon, the twin cities of Lower England, with the winding summer city of the Thames between, and I see the gaunt dirt of old Edinburgh die to rise again, white and tall beneath the shadow of her ancient hill, and Dublin too, reshaped, returned enriched, fair, spacious, the city of rich laughter and warm hearts, gleaming gaily in a shaft of sunlight through the soft warm rain. I see the great cities America has planned and made, the golden city, with ever-ripening fruit along its broad, warm ways, and the bell-glad city of 1,000 spires. I see again, as I have seen, the city of theaters and meeting places, the city of the sunlight bite, and the new city that is still called Utah. and dominated by its observatory dome and the plain and dignified lines of the university facade upon the cliff. Martenabar, the great white winter city of the upland snows, and the lesser places too, the townships, the quiet resting places, villages half forest with a brawl of streams down their streets, villages laced with avenues of cedar, villages of garden, of roses, and wonderful flowers and the perpetual humming of bees. And through all the world go our children, our sons the old world would have made into servile clerks and shopmen, plough drudges and servants, our daughters, who were erst anemic drudges, prostitutes, sluts, anxiety-racked mothers, or sere, repining failures. They go about this world glad and brave, learning, living, doing, happy and rejoicing, brave and free. I think of them wandering in the clear quiet of the ruins of Rome, among the tombs of Egypt or the temples of Athens, or they're coming to Mainington and its strange happiness, to Orba and the wonder of its white and slender tower. But who can tell of the fullness and pleasure of life? Who can number all our new cities in the world? Cities made by the loving hands of men for living men. Cities men weep to enter, so fair they are, so gracious and so kind. Some vision surely of these things must have been vouchsafed me, as I sat there behind Melmont's couch, but now my knowledge of accomplished things has mingled with and effaced my expectations. Something indeed I must have foreseen, or else why was my heart so glad? Book 3, The New World. Chapter 1, Love After the Change. Section 1. So far I have said nothing of Nettie. I have departed widely from my individual story. I tried to give you the effect of the change in relation to the general framework of human life, its effect of swift, magnificent dawn, of an overpowering letting, an inundation of life and the spirit of living. In my memory, all my life before the change has the quality of a dark passage, with the dimmest side gleams of beauty that come and go. The rest is dull pain and darkness. Then suddenly the walls, the bitter confines, are smitten and vanish, and I walk, blinded, perplexed, and yet rejoicing, in this sweet, beautiful world, in its fair, incessant variety, its satisfaction, its opportunities, exultant in this glorious gift of life. Had I the power of music, I would make a worldwide motif swell and amplify, gather to itself this theme and that, and rise at last to sheer ecstasy of triumph and rejoicing. It should be all sound, all pride, all the hope of outsetting in the morning brightness, all the glee of unexpected happenings, all the gladness of painful effort suddenly come to its reward. It should be like blossoms new opened and the happy play of children, like tearful happy mothers holding their firstborn, like cities building to the sound of music and great ships, all hung with flags and wine bespattered, gliding down through cheering multitudes to their first meeting with the sea. Through it all should march hope, confident hope, radiant and invincible, until at last it would be the triumph march of Hope the Conqueror, coming with trumpetings and banners through the wide-flung gates of the world. And then out of that luminous haze of gladness comes Nettie, transfigured. So she came to me again, amazing, a thing incredibly forgotten. She comes back, and Varral is in her company. She comes back into my memories now, just as she came back then, rather quaintly at first not seen very clearly, a little distorted by intervening things, seen with a doubt, as I saw her through the slightly discolored panes of crinkled glass in the window of the Minton post office and grocer's shop. It was on the second day after the change, and I had been sending telegrams for Melmount, who was making arrangements for his departure for Downing Street. I saw the two of them, at first as small, flawed figures. The glass made them seem curved, and it enhanced and altered their gestures and paces. I felt it became me to say peace to them, and I went out to the jangling of the doorbell. At the sight of me they stopped short, and Varral cried with the note of one who has sought, "Here he is!" And Nettie cried, "Willie!" I went toward them, and all the perspectives of my reconstructed universe altered as I did so. I seemed to see these two for the first time, how fine they were, how graceful and human. It was as though I had never really looked at them before, and indeed, always before I had beheld them through a mist of selfish passion. They had shared the universal darkness and dwarfing of the former time. They shared the universal exaltation of the new. Now suddenly Nettie, and the love of Nettie, a great passion for Nettie, lived again in me. This change, which had enlarged men's hearts, had made no end to love. Indeed, it had enormously enlarged and glorified love. She stepped into the center of that dream of world reconstruction that filled my mind and took possession of it all. A little wisp of hair had blown across her cheek, her lips fell apart in that sweet smile of hers, her eyes were full of wonder, of a welcoming scrutiny, of an infinitely courageous friendliness. I took her outstretched hand and wonder overwhelmed me. "I wanted to kill you," I said simply, trying to grasp that idea. It seemed now like stabbing the stars or murdering the sunlight. "Afterward we looked for you," said Varol, "and we could not find you. We heard another shot." I turned my eyes to him and Nettie's hand fell from me. It was then I thought of how they had fallen together and what it must have been like to waken in that dawn with Nettie by one side. I had a vision of them as I had glanced them last amidst the thickening vapors, close together, hand in hand. The green hawks of the change spread their darkling wings above their last stumbling paces. So they fell, and awoke, lovers together in a morning of paradise. Who can tell how bright the sunshine was to them, how fair the flowers, how sweet the singing of the birds? This was the thought of my heart, but my lips were saying, when I awoke I threw my pistol away. Sheer blankness kept my thoughts silent for a little while. I said empty things. "I am very glad I did not kill you, that you are here so fair and well." "I am going away back to Clayton on the day after tomorrow," I said, breaking away to explanations. "I have been writing shorthand here for Melmount, but that is almost over now." Neither of them said a word, and though all facts had suddenly ceased to matter anything, I went on informatively. "He is to be taken to Downing Street, where there is a proper staff, so that there will be no need of me. Of course, you are a little perplexed at my being with Melmount. You see, I met him by accident, directly I recovered. I found him with a broken ankle in that lane. I am to go now to the 4 towns to help prepare a report, so that I am glad to see you both again." I found a catch in my voice, "to say goodbye to you and wish you well." This was after the quality of what had come into my mind when first I saw them through the grocer's window, but it was not what I felt and thought as I said it. I went on saying it because otherwise there would have been a gap. It had come to me that it was going to be hard to part from Nettie. My words sounded with an effect of unreality. I stopped and we stood for a moment in silence looking at one another. It was I think, who was discovering most. I was realizing for the first time how little the change had altered in my essential nature. I had forgotten this business of love for a time in the world of wonder, that was all. Nothing was lost from my nature, nothing had gone. Only the power of thought and restraint had been wonderfully increased, and new interests had been forced upon me. The green vapors had passed, our minds were swept and garnished, but we were ourselves still. Though living in a new and finer air, my affinities were unchanged. Nettie's personal charm for me was only quickened by the enhancement of my perceptions. In her presence, meeting her eyes, instantly my desire, no longer frantic but sane, was awake again. It was just like going to Checkshill in the old time after writing about socialism. I relinquished her hand. It was absurd to part in these terms. So we all felt it. We hung awkwardly over our sense of that. It was Varol, I think, who shaped the thought for me, and said that tomorrow then we must meet and say goodbye, and so turned our encounter into a transitory making of arrangements. We settled we would come to the inn at Minton, all 3 of us, and take our midday meal together. It was clear that was all we had to say now. We parted a little awkwardly. I went on down the village street, not looking back, surprised at myself and infinitely perplexed. It was as if I had discovered something overlooked that disarranged all my plans, something entirely disconcerting. For the first time, I went back preoccupied and without eagerness to Melmount's work. I wanted to go on thinking about Nettie. My mind had suddenly become voluminously productive concerning her and Varol. Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 2. The talk we 3 had together in the dawn of the new time is very strongly impressed upon my memory. There was something fresh and simple about it, something young and flushed and exalted. We handled with a certain naive timidity the most difficult questions the change had raised for men to solve. I recall we had made little of them. All the old scheme of human life had dissolved and passed away. The narrow competitiveness, the greed and base aggression, the jealous aloofness of soul from soul, where had it left us? That was what we and 1,000,000,000 others were discussing. It chances that this last meeting with Nettie is inseparably associated, I don't know why, with the landlady of the Minton Inn. The Minton Inn was one of the rare pleasant corners of the old order. It was an inn of an unusual prosperity, much frequented by visitors from Championbury, and given to the serving of lunches and teas. It had a broad, mossy bowling green, and round about it were creeper-covered arbors amidst beds of snapdragon and hollyhock, blue delphinium, and many such tall, familiar summer flowers. These stood out against a background of laurels and holly, and above these again rose the gables of the inn and its signpost, a white-horsed George slaying the dragon against copper beeches under the sky. While I waited for Nettie and Verrall in this agreeable trysting place, I talked to the landlady, a broad-shouldered, smiling, freckled woman, about the morning of the change. That motherly, abundant, red-haired figure of health was buoyantly sure that everything in the world was now to be changed for the better. That confidence and something in her voice made me love her as I talked to her. "Now we're awake," she said. "All sorts of things will be put right that hadn't any sense in them. Why? Oh, I'm sure of it." Her kind blue eyes met mine in an infinitude of friendliness, her lips and her pauses shaped in a pretty faint smile. Old tradition was strong in us. All English inns in those days charged the unexpected, and I asked what our lunch was to cost. "Pay or not," she said, "and what you like. It's holidays these days. I suppose we'll still have paying and charging. However, we manage it, but it won't be the worry it has been, that I feel sure. It's the part I never had fancy for. Many a time I peeped through the bushes, worrying to think what was just and right to me and mine, and what would send 'em away satisfied. It isn't the money I cared for. There'll be mighty changes, be sure of that, but here I'll stay and make people happy. Them that go by on the roads. It's a pleasant place here when people are merry. It's only when they're jealous or mean or tired or eat up beyond any stomach's digesting or when they got the drink in 'em that Satan comes into this garden. Many's the happy face I've seen here and many that come again like friends, but nothing to equal what's going to be. Now things are being set right." She smiled, that bounteous woman, with the joy of life and hope. "You shall have an omelet," she said, "you and your friends. Such an omelet like they'll make 'em in heaven. I feel there's cooking in me these days. I've never cooked before. I'm rejoiced to have it to do." It was just then that Nettie and Verrall appeared under a rustic archway of crimson roses that led out from the inn. Nettie wore white and a sun hat, and Verrall was a figure of grey. "Here are my friends," I said, but for all the magic of the change, something passed athwart the sunlight in my soul like the passing of a shadow of a cloud. "A pretty couple," said the landlady, and they crossed the velvet green toward us. They were indeed a pretty couple, but that did not greatly gladden me. No, I winced a little at that. Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 3. This old newspaper, the first reissue of the new paper, desiccated last relic of a vanished age, is like the little piece of identification the superstitious of the old days, those queer religionists who brought a certain black-clad Mrs. Piper to the help of Christ, used to put into the hands of a clairvoyant. At the crisp touch of it, I look across a gulf of 50 years and see again the three of us sitting about that table in the arbor, and I smell again the smell of the sweet briar that filled the air about us, and hear in our long pauses the abundant murmuring of bees among the heliotrope of the borders. It is the dawn of the new time, but we bear, all three of us, the marks and liveries of the old. I see myself, a dark, ill-dressed youth, with the bruise of Lord Redcar gave me still blue and yellow beneath my jaw. And young Verrall sits cornerwise to me, better grown, better dressed, fair and quiet, 2 years my senior indeed, but looking no older than I because of his light complexion. And opposite me is Nettie, with dark eyes upon my face, graver and more beautiful than I had ever seen her in the former time. Her dress is still that white one she had worn when I came upon her in the park, and still about her dainty neck she wears her string of pearls and a little coin of gold. She is so much the same, she is so changed, a girl then and now a woman, and all my agony and all the marvel of the change between. Over the end of the green table about which we sit, a spotless cloth is spread. It bears a pleasant lunch spread out with a simple equipage. Behind me is the liberal sunshine of the green and various garden. I see it all. Again I sit there, eating awkwardly. This paper lies upon the table and Verrall talks of the change. You can't imagine, he says in his sure, fine accents, how much the change has destroyed of me. I still don't feel awake. Men of my sort are so tremendously made. I never suspected it before. He leans over the table toward me with an evident desire to make himself perfectly understood. I find myself like some creature that is taken out of its shell, soft and new. I was trained to dress in a certain way, to behave in a certain way, to think in a certain way. But I see now it's all wrong and narrow, most of it anyhow, a system of class shibboleths. We were decent to each other in order to be a gang to the rest of the world, gentlemen indeed, but it's perplexing. I can hear his voice saying that now, and see the lift of his eyebrow and his pleasant smile. He paused. He wanted to say that, but it was not the thing we had to say. I leant forward a little and took hold of my glass very lightly. You two, I said, will marry? They looked at one another. Nettie spoke very softly. I did not mean to marry when I came away, she said. I know, I answered. I looked up with a sense of effort and met Viral's eyes. He answered me, I think we two have joined our lives, but the thing that took us was a sort of madness. I nodded. All passion, I said, is madness. Then I fell into a doubting of those words. Why did we do those things, he said, turning to her suddenly. Her hands were clasped under her chin, her eyes downcast. We had to, she said, with her old trick of inadequate expression. Then she seemed to open out suddenly. Willie, she cried, with a sudden directness, with her eyes appealing to me, I didn't mean to treat you badly. Indeed, I didn't. I kept thinking of you and of mother and father all the time, only it didn't seem to move me. It didn't move me not one bit from the way I had chosen. Chosen, I said. Something seemed to have hold of me, she admitted. It's all so unaccountable. She gave a little gesture of despair. Viral's fingers played on the cloth for a space, then he turned his face to me again. Something said, take her,